Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this
Hi.
evening for our discussions on Jacquard's Web. Tonight, we're going to be discussing chapters 8 and 9.
Yeah, it was great.
Was it great?
I thought the first chapter 8 was just a little boring, but 9 was quite a bit. I don't know. I don't want to say juicier, but at least it was an easier read. And
Did you
I wanted
find?
to know more about Ada.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I have to agree. I have to say there was definitely some more lightheartedness to Ada's story than the latter side of Mr. Babbage's story,
Well,
which of
that's
course
true.
we all had sort of foretold or foreseen coming when we were discussing last week's chapters and some of his failures associated with coming up with progressions on his first machine, the difference machine, and then of course moving on to the analytical design engine.
Yes.
Excuse me, yeah, engine. It doesn't sort of sound intuitive when we're talking about computers
No.
to say
It's
an
an
engine,
like
but
they're-
you have to think of the time period. The
That's
Industrial
true.
Revolution was here, and Charles Babbage, who we really talked a lot about last week, was at the beginning of chapter 8 really facing some funding issues.
We learned a lot about him and his temper and
Yeah, and
his
unfortunately, the author was very honest in
Yeah.
telling us that he was probably too overly honest when he shared that he had basically given up on his difference machine to focus on the analytical machine. And so the government did not kind of think it was fair that he decided to drop this project, even though they have given him like 17,000 pounds
pounds at that time.
and most
period.
likely was going to need about that much
Mhm.
to complete the project. So knowing that he had abandoned it, they were not feeling so confident to try and sort of open up the purse strings and give him carte blanche to make decisions as he liked.
Sarah and I had a conversation just a few hours ago about Mr. Babbage and his excitement about moving on with his next venture,
Right.
and was just very open about like, oh, you know what? I've got this new idea, and I need more money. And the prime minister says, I'm not going to do that. But, I understood his excitement about that.
Mhm.
And for all of you at home who have more than one or two looms, raise your hand. Okay, because I get really excited about something and I get it warped and I weave 12 inches, but I am now on to the second and third project.
Right.
And the first one has gone to the wayside. I'll finish it because that's just the guy I am.
Mhm.
But I'm excited about the next one. And I can
Right.
see exactly where his head was going because this was going to add so much more.
Right. And I think, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we sort of wrap up all the areas that he could have done things differently.
Yeah.
The thing I think that you have to take away from this is he doesn't think of this as an evolution on that project necessarily, but two completely different projects
Yeah.
where he was using similar sort of technologies
And
to achieve two totally different goals.
And am I right, Sarah? I mean, in the reading and try to comprehend all this,
Mhm.
that difference machine was really for mathematics, where this new analytical machine was also going to combine other parts of science.
Sure, it
And
was
so
limitless what its functions
what it could do.
Right,
So-
it's based on what was be able to program into it.
So who
right?
would be excited about that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, at the time, the prime minister was Sir Robert Peel.
Mhm.
And Robert Peel was, I don't know if it was a combination of like worst place, worst time scenario, but he had a lot on his plate. And one of the things that we brought up in conversation the other day is that you happened to come across a nice PBS publication that brought up just this time period in England.
I had closed the book up and I thought, okay, before I go to bed, I'm just going to put on PBS. And now they're talking about the famine in
The Irish potato
famine and how it was just wiping out the crops and killing not only the plants but the tubers, the roots, the potatoes themselves in the ground, and they're starving.
Right.
And guess who's the prime minister in charge of taking care of these people who were also supplying Great Britain with a great number of food.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that Deb's going to include in tonight's discussions are two articles that I found on the Irish potato famine. And this is quite a comprehensive website if you have a chance to read into it more, but think it helps you better understand the climate during this time period. Babbage, as well as Ada Lovelace, they live in these like sort of sheltered, opulent worlds because of the upper crust that they belong to. But this website is super, super informative. Now, I'm also going to include a second one, which this one is more about the Peel story and what his contributions are, some of the acts that he put in place to help with it. But the reality is that the famine was such that there were people dying. That was his main focus.
Yeah.
And some of the statistics that I found, the deaths were not necessarily attributed to always starvation, but with starvations, people's immune systems were reduced. And they were dying from fever and dysentery and just like unhealthy conditions. And so almost 300,000 people died during
That's an awful
his
lot.
time in office. So, you know, you put things into perspective. And here's Babbage, like, I need more money to make my analytical machine. And Peel's like, let's put things in perspective. I got a lot of other things I'm thinking about here. And you can see how that would snowball into a situation where no one's on their best behavior. And different time, different place, maybe it would have gone slightly differently.
I'm sure Mr. Peel's wife found him just a slightly bit irritable.
Yeah. Well, and to sort of make things worse is Peel never actually gives him a conclusion. He ends up pawning this off onto an astronomer named George Airy, right? And you would think that he'd be a really good advocate for this machine because of the field that he's in, the fact that he's accustomed to doing long, lengthy, repetitive calculations himself. But it turns out like he's not a fan at all. He shuts it down, basically says his machine is worthless. And that was the nail in the coffin. Yeah. Right. And that's kind of sad, right? That it got to that point. But the thing about the time that I think that we have to remember, and Essinger put this wonderful quote within this chapter that I have to share again, that if ever there was an age in which deployed remarkable energy in planning and advancing the practical implementation of innovative technology, it was the 19th century. Like we're in the heart of it. And so Babbage shared this mentality of a confidence in the future, a conviction that life is getting better, and a belief that man not only has the potential for happiness and self-fulfillment, but has a duty to actively pursue these destinies. And so like somebody who has a very creative mind, somebody who has a very engineering focus in this time period would have felt like this was like devastating, being shut down this way. And he goes on to say the spirit of optimism governed thought and action, and above all, the age believed in the power of machinery to achieve almost anything. And this is like so deep rooted in exactly what we're talking about.
You know, reading that quote though, I can't imagine. First of all, these are people of means. They're privileged people.
Sure.
If you gave that same quote to somebody who was an
illiterate, a coal miner,
poor person, they're going to go, "What hope do I have?"
Right? Why does this affect my life? Because Babbage was sort of ahead of his time, just like Jacquard was ahead of his time. Ada Lovelace was ahead of her time in the thought process because they were limited with things like the manufacturing process or a government standing in place of giving the proper funding. And, you know, all this kind of boils down to that Babbage understood that machines were there to make up for like the incompetencies of humans, the things that we weren't able to do or that were not financially sort of beneficial for them to spend that kind of money on. Yeah. Does that make sense?
So, it was an interesting chapter.
Yeah. Now, I have to say that Ada sort of bridges this chapter together. And Ada is a captivating woman, right? She's a woman who is completely fascinated with Babbage's work from the very first time that she meets him, along with her mother and another mathematician, female friend. Now, she was thrilled to sort of consider how this analytical machine that Babbage is theorizing could be put into practical applications. Now, it doesn't really make sense that the average woman would be interested in these sort of subjects.
No. But Babbage, was really taken with her.
He really
You know,
was.
he's in his 40s. She's 17 years of age. She's so smart. She is right up there. I'm reading this and I'm thinking,
Tell me more.
tell me more. But this is like a very young Melinda Gates who, I mean, is just brilliant and
Sure.
just like a perfect match, like with Bill Gates. But here's Mr. Babbage. You're thinking, gosh, I could really sit down and have a
nice
meaningful conversation
This
with
is
this
somebody
young
who
lady.
is like-minded
Yeah.
with me. This is somebody who's passionate about these ideas. And
Yeah.
with math being one of her personal favorite pastimes, it must have just been intriguing. And how wonderful that her mom allowed such a person in her periphery, especially for most women of this time period. They're focusing on preparing to enter society and choose to take on a husband. Her mother's like, sure, let's go have tea with the eccentric down the road, talking about his analytical machine, because she
Yeah.
was just as jazzed up about it
She
as well.
was.
Yeah.
She had a really rough start, though, don't you think? Right from the beginning.
Yeah, she really did. And
Her dad was a mess.
He was a mess. Now, Essinger goes in this chapter and talks a little bit about how he would love to know what Ada Lovelace thought about like modern computers if she had a
Oh.
chance to look at it. And he sort of thinks maybe she might be a little disappointed in the fact that it doesn't have that same sort of cog and wheel technology that Babbage had integrated into all of his
What's
design.
intriguing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love that Essinger was able to sort of theorize that most likely Babbage wouldn't have a problem with all of the modern innovations that have happened to computers. This is just what was limited in the technology to hit available. And this was a commonly used, it's like the use of a new pieces of a technology having a USB port integrated into it. Almost everything does, because it's a universal technology that we use to relay information. Cog and wheels would have been used for a whole lot of things. And so, I think he'd be thrilled to see what was available now. I mean, a circuit board to him would be like,
I know, great.
Can you imagine blowing their minds with a circuit board? Yeah.
And I'm still intrigued by looking down the top of my pepper mill and
Right,
I'm watching
exactly.
it, and it's like, ooh, wow, how
Look
cool
at
is
that cool thing.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that you have to sort of keep in mind when it comes to Ada is that she was one of those right place, right time. She had two amazing parents in their own rights, maybe not together necessarily, but their brief marriage and her birth, I think Dad pieced out when she was about 2 months old.
Yeah, I mean, he just left.
Yeah, just left, said, it's been great, I'll keep in touch, but she never saw him ever again.
No.
Even though he was this world-renowned, very sort of
well-respected
poet within all the important circles, he was not an active person in her life, but obviously had influenced her greatly.
It's a good thing her mother was well off in her own right.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that her mom was pretty forward-thinking and pretty liberal in her own ideas as well, not only in the company that she kept, but the fact that she allowed her to have such a broad education. This was a woman who had all the advantages of studying lots of languages, mathematics, world history, things that a common woman would not have.
That's right. You're sort of gearing your child up for a life of being a homemaker and a mother and everything. And she realized, man, I've got a real rip snorter here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do my best to get her in the best schools.
Sure.
To prepare her for an amazing.
Well, see, here's the
off
thing.
to Annabella.
Yeah, Annabella. But here there's a little bit of conflict there because she also was very traditionally minded in that she still wanted her to be smart and well-rounded, but she still also wanted her to marry the upper echelon, older aristocracy even, the ones that have had titles for more than, 100 years.
100 years.
I mean, she had very clear ideas because she was of that sect. She came from a lot of money herself and wanted to make sure that Ada went on to live a life of leisure as well.
And, really, who wouldn't want that for your child?
Sure.
But Annabella, I mean, she also was growing up in a time when she just sort of remembers a few decades before what happened in France. I mean, all the aristocracy was getting their heads chopped off.
Well, that's absolutely true. Yeah. But now all the hairdressers had a new line of work.
So we're gonna give this child every
Sure.
opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I mean, the friendship that she develops with Babbage seems a little unlikely. You
Mhm.
know, when you look at the two of them, they're forward thinkers in their own mind.
Mhm.
And so when they sort of make this connection and they frequently correspond with each other, I think they described 80 letters from Ada
Yeah.
and like 30 or 40 from him, as well as many that they know are documented in other letters but never found, means that they had a very healthy correspondence period, as
And
well as frequent meetups.
and I tell you, in this chapter, I'm taking my imaginary hat off to Mr. Essinger for finding all these letters. I mean, like,
Right? Yeah.
who knew they even existed?
Well,
But he
I think
painstakingly going through that and just really getting a
Yeah.
feel
I
for
think
the
there's been a
relationship that
lot
they
of people
had.
before that. I think that they've looked into a lot of Ada's letters since about the 1950s
Oh,
because they said like she started getting a notoriety about 100 years. And that's right around when modern computers came
oh,
into the scene. In fact, one of the fun things that we learned during this chapter was some of the influences that she had. This is a great website about how there was actually a computer program called the Ada program.
no kidding. Huh.
It was started in the 1970s by a French computer scientist, and this article goes into the features of how it works if you're a real coding nerd. But it also sort of says that this French computer scientist was funded through the United States Department of Defense. So their information technologies that they were developing from 1977 to 83 was called the Ada program.
Wow.
I thought that was kind of a little
Yeah.
fun tidbit that they
Hmm.
respected the material that she had presented and all of her writings and sort of
Yeah.
said, I'll give you some credit here. Now, one of the things that I think is important to remember is that Ada had only been privy to Babbage's theories of this machine. He never actually built one. It was all
completed
theorized.
anything. Yeah.
He had loads of documents where he had diagrams in his writings. He was nice enough to have a French, Menabre, I think was his name,
Yes.
do sort of a tribute to him and say how brilliant he was. He really went into a lot of detail to describe it, but it made it to the French market. And what Ada decided was that it was within her means, and she had the available time after doing several years of self-course study with a tutor in mathematics that she was going to interpret this document. I don't know if he had encouraged it or if she went after it and then he worked collaboratively with her. But how wonderful that she said there's a need for this. People should know how it's important. If we're going to get funding to see this project, we need to seek out the right investors.
And she was just the right person
She was just the right person.
for him
That's exactly
to
right.
promote all of this.
Right, exactly. So Ada gets to work on this. She puts her own sort of spin on it, but you can tell through the interpretations that it's definitely her because it has a very feminine edge to it. It sort of is flowered by details that only she would know through her frequent discussions with Babbage on it. To the point that he says, "Bravo! You even found an error that I made. How great for you that you were able to
And
do
that must have
that."
been very hard for him because,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think that all along he's been good to sort of give credit to Jacquard and people
Well-
before him. He's a pretty humble guy that way, but it'd be hard for your interpreter to point out a very important detail.
And a young lady at that, right?
Right,
Yeah.
at that. I wonder though, just based on how openly he discussed and the fact that he hosted her mother and this other female, he may have been so progressive that the fact that she was a female didn't really matter to him.
Well, from what I read in here, I mean, her mother was not really particularly keen
No.
on the relationship that they were having.
Right.
As a matter of fact, Ada really shared a lot of their personal life and secrets with this Mr. Babbage, and Annabella was very uncomfortable with all of that.
Well, I'm sure. I mean, when you're of the upper echelon, you don't
Mhm.
necessarily want all your things aired out to the public. But there's also to be something said that when the public was questioning, or people of modern age question,
Mhm.
how much of these contributions were her own ideas versus things that maybe Babbage fed to her and had her write.
Mhm.
I think that there's too much supporting evidence that she comprehended it based on other writing styles. There was a passage that they quoted from her that I thought was sort of like a really great example of her writing style. And I'll let you sort of read the passage, but the thing that really holds true, and Essinger points out, is that if someone were to read this and not know when it was written, they would have assumed that it came right out of a modern software manual
Yes.
in the language, right? There might be key phrases based on the terminology that was available during her time period, but for the most part, it distinguishes from objects operated upon. Like, we use system operations as common language now in our writing when we're talking about coding within computer systems.
And
It's
the fact that
brilliant.
she said that 100 years ago.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Now, the problem is that when she's written this, it's become noticeable. She goes to Babbage and says, we've had a relationship for many years. Let me be your advocate. Let me be your voice. Let me be your champion, and continue to help you develop these projects, which I think is really big of her. And many artists through history need people like that, because we know he was not politically motivated. He did not speak that language, and often that got him in trouble.
It did.
Yeah. So she wanted to continue championing it, but something happened along the way. We're not quite sure in the readings what happened, but she ended up becoming ill. What they think at this point was uterine cancer. She also developed an addiction to laudanum at the time. And laudanum, if you've not ever heard of it, if you read any romance novels, you hear it a lot, especially sort of like historical stuff. But this, during the Victorian era, was a very common at-home product. It's not like when you read it and say, oh, it's opium mixed with brandy, makes her sound like she was like cracked out in her house. But this was a product that was advertised right along things that were meant for children in your local or in your newspaper.
Put on the baby's gums for teething.
Yeah. I do love the fact that they named it laudanum poison, like pure poison. Somehow people put trust in that was something they should be ingesting, regardless of the labeling. But
I'm
who's
sure,
to judge?
at that time period, she was in excruciating pain, and it probably gave her some relief.
Yeah.
She died early.
She did die early. She was only 37 years old,
which is tragic.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to, because I'm in that age bracket.
Yeah.
Ironically, she was about the same age as her dad, and we kind of bring this back around the fact that she was buried right next to her father.
The man who left her as an infant.
And that she only kept in touch with through poems that he sent to her.
Yeah, and yet they're
entombed together. Yeah, forever and ever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't go on to read any more about what became of Ada Lovelace's husband, which, as I read the chapters, I sort of imagined him as like a Ken doll. He was very shiny, but not very intelligent. But the advantage of, and maybe she was very good at choosing just the right spouse, but he fit all the bulletin points that Mom wanted, that he was from the aristocracy.
Yep.
He was beautiful to look at, so procreating and giving him 3 children was not a problem. But he was also very compliant with saying, sure, go do your math thing, go hang out with your tutor and do that thing you do.
And he went off hunting and foxing and
the
all
things
of
that they do.
They do.
But she managed to do all this on top of raising her kids, along with some nannies, and running, I think she had 3 households.
3 homes.
3 households,
yeah.
which, it's not like they're right down the road and she's managing some condos. These are huge properties with rolling estates and people, and yet she did this on the side for fun.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty wonderful.
And just to handle all of that and to balance it out. Luckily, she's brilliant, and perhaps it wasn't as difficult for her as it might be for other people.
No, I agree. Now, Babbage outsurvives her. Even though he's a number of years older, he goes on to live, but he sort of becomes a recluse. He continues to obsess about these ideas, continue to work on these projects, but without funding, it's sort of just his mission to write down and record and refine as much as he can, because he can't afford to buy thousands of cogs that are consistently made the same size in a reasonable amount of time.
Just the whole idea of making all of those,
Right.
you know,
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's go back to the machine, the one
yeah,
that they
look at that.
actually made. Some of the details that we looked of these cogs, these are made by modern machinery that can be incredibly precise, but they needed thousands of them, and some of the stuff was just not feasible to have manufactured, and so it put a stop on things.
Yeah.
Now, although society didn't necessarily shun him, but he never really got the fame that Jacquard got before he died. Those manuals, or all of those notes that he put down for the rest of his days, were so detailed that we were able to produce it a decade and a half later.
Yeah.
Which is pretty awesome.
I don't know. I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but
That's
this
okay.
whole idea of Babbage, he lived a little later on, and we did find out in previous chapters that, and we know that he inherited so much money,
Yeah.
but when he passed away, he was also a very wealthy man. And I kept thinking, why is he not putting a lot of his own money into
Sure.
this? But he left his family, his children. I think he and his wife had 4 children, and then Ada Lovelace, she had 3 children. What happened to those children?
Oh, right.
And what accomplishments did they do?
Yeah,
You know,
I always make these assumptions
genetics,
that
how
genetics
cool.
is what it is. You're given the examples in front of you. Maybe they rejected it. Maybe they thought he was just an absolute kook, and
Well, I'm sure many people thought he was a
yeah,
bit of a kook.
yeah.
But he had great
We'll have
parties.
to dig a little deeper and see what became of their children.
Yeah.
I kept thinking back to Eliza Lucas during this. For those of you who followed us during the
Oh,
Indigo
yeah.
Girl, I kept thinking about the relationship that Eliza Lucas had with her neighbor, right?
Mhm.
That she ended up marrying in the end. They had the same sort of age differential. I think he was just about the same age as her
Mhm.
father. But it was an academic or partnership type of relationship,
Right.
which is unique and we don't see a lot of examples of in this modern.
Not much,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'd love to know what happened to their children.
I would too. I would too. Let's talk about what's going on next week. We are going to be taking a look at chapters 10, 11, and 12. And you know what, guys? This is going to be week 4. During those weeks, we're going to be looking at some crises with the American census. We are going to be looking at how Jacquard looms that wove information, as well as the birth of IBM. So we're talking about a real spring forward in
Jump
time
in time.
compared to the century we're talking
Yeah.
about now. Yeah. So Janice has a question down here, and this is good to bring up with everybody. The links are saved right in the chat section. So when we're done here tonight and we log off, these comments will stay forever and ever. So you feel free to share them with other people that perhaps might
Mhm.
find them interesting or peruse yourself. They will also be listed. Actually, the video, will also be doubly listed on our YouTube channel if you don't
You
have a
are
Facebook.
clever, honestly.
Oh,
When
I
you
don't
pull
know.
this whole thing together, I'm really
I didn't
impressed.
develop the software, that's for sure. I just learned how to use it.
Well,
Thank you, Judith. We had a very nice evening this evening. And again, next week we're going to jump into some really interesting stuff. And now we're really
Yeah.
going to be talking about computers that we can truly identify with in our own lifetime.
and I'm going to try to join you from Florida. I'm going to be down there next
That's right.
week.
So we're going to be interview mode. Sarah on this side, Tom on this side,
Mhm.
and we're gonna have fun with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. For those of you who live in our region and experience an entire day of snow, rain, stay safe on the road tonight as temperatures kind of
drop again.
Yeah.
And Saturday, we're supposed to have some more bad weather. So it's a good time to just stay indoors, make
Read
some
your
soup,
book.
and read your book.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone.
Take care.